Chapter 1. The Marriage Contract. The creditors came like ravens to a corpse. Evangeline Hartwick watched from the frost-etched library window as they stripped her childhood home bare. A Chippendale desk her grandfather had commissioned. Her mother's pianoforte. Even the portrait of great-aunt Lucinda, whose perpetual scowl had frightened Evangeline as a child, disappeared into a wagon that creaked under the weight of her family's ruin. Lady Evangeline. The butler's voice trembled. Poor Hensworth. 60 years of service, and now he stood in a manor with empty rooms and emptier coffers. Your father requests your presence in his study. She found him there, collapsed in the leather chair that somehow the creditors had missed. Or perhaps they'd left it out of pity. A half-empty brandy bottle sat at his elbow. Lord Edmund Hartwick, who had once walked these halls with the confidence of old nobility, now looked like a man waiting for the gallows. Evangeline. He couldn't meet her eyes. I've made arrangements. Ice slid down her spine. What arrangements? A gentleman has offered to assume our debts. All of them. Your mother will have her medicines. Thomas can finish university. The creditors will. What's the price? She knew. Of course she knew. In this world, there was only one thing a bankrupt lord could offer. Father, what have you done? He finally looked at her. And the shame in his eyes told her everything before his lips moved. Your hand in marriage. The room tilted. Evangeline gripped the desk edge, feeling the wood grain bite into her palm. To whom? King Aleksandr. The name landed like a stone in still water, ripples of implication spreading outward. King Aleksandr. The vampire who had ruled Britain's supernatural aristocracy for 2 centuries. The cold sovereign whose policies kept humans and vampires in uneasy coexistence. Whose iron will had crushed 3 rebellions. Whose eyes, so the rumors said, could freeze blood in your veins. He's a monster. The words escaped before she could stop them. He's a king. Her father's voice cracked. And he's offering us salvation. Your mother is dying, Evangeline. The physicians say 6 months without treatment. Thomas will be expelled. Branded the son of a debtor. And you. He gestured helplessly at the empty room. What prospects do you have? A girl of 23 with no dowry. No connections. No. So, you've sold me. I'm saving this family. Evangeline turned away before he could see the fury in her eyes, or the cold calculation already forming beneath it. Her father saw only doom in this arrangement. But she'd spent her life reading, learning, observing the world beyond drawing rooms and garden parties. She understood power. She understood leverage. And she understood opportunity. 3 days later, a carriage arrived at twilight. Black lacquer gleaming like oil, pulled by horses whose eyes reflected red in the gaslight. The royal crest, a crown pierced by a sword, glinted silver on the door. Evangeline descended the steps in her finest remaining gown, chin high, spine straight. The coachman didn't speak, didn't even look at her as he opened the door. Inside, the seats were upholstered in crimson velvet that whispered against her skirts like a living thing. The journey through London's fog-shrouded streets felt like passage between worlds. Familiar landmarks, the church where she'd been christened, the park where she'd walked as a girl slid past the window like ghosts. Then the city changed. Buildings grew taller, darker. Gas lamps burned with blue flame instead of gold. She'd entered the vampire district. Blackthorne Palace rose from the darkness like a crown of obsidian. Gothic spires clawed at the night sky. Windows glowed with amber light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The walls were black marble veined with crimson, as if the stone itself bled. Inside, silence pressed down like a physical weight. Her footsteps echoed on floors polished to mirrors. Portraits lined the walls, previous vampire rulers, each more imposing than the last. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her progress through corridors that stretched impossibly long. The throne room doors opened without a sound. He stood before a massive fireplace where flames danced green and gold. Tall, perfectly still. His coat was black velvet over a silver waistcoat, his cravat tied with precision that spoke of centuries of practice. Dark hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Then he turned. And Evangeline forgot to breathe. His eyes were pale as winter ice, and they assessed her with the cold calculation of a predator measuring prey. Not a flicker of warmth, not a hint of human softness. When he moved, it was with inhuman grace, fluid, economical, perfect. Lady Evangeline Hartwick. His voice was cultured, educated, utterly devoid of emotion. I trust your journey was comfortable. She forced herself to curtsy, though every instinct screamed to run. "Your Majesty, let us dispense with pleasantries. You know why you're here." He gestured to a table where documents lay spread like surrender terms. "The contract is straightforward. You will bear the title of queen. You will appear at my side at required functions. You will maintain the dignity expected of your position. In return, your family's debts are erased, and they receive a generous annuity." Evangeline approached the table, forcing her hands not to shake. The contract was written in precise script, each word a small cage. She read slowly, methodically, aware of his gaze on her like ice against skin. "You will reside in the Queen's chambers. You will not leave the palace without permission and escort. You will receive visitors only with prior approval. You will—" "I have amendments." Her voice cut through his recitation. Silence. Then, impossibly, a hint of amusement flickered in those frozen eyes. "Indeed, I require the right to correspond with my family without censorship, access to the palace library, and permission to continue my charitable work with London's orphanages. You believe you're in a position to negotiate. I believe you need a queen who appears willing, not broken." She met his gaze without flinching. "A woman in chains makes poor theater, Your Majesty, but a queen who walks beside you, who smiles at your court, who plays her role with grace, that serves your purpose far better. And my terms are modest." For a long moment, he studied her. She felt dissected by that gaze. Every weakness catalogued, every strength measured and found wanting. "You're not what I expected." He moved to the table, took up a pen, and made neat additions to the contract. "Correspondence granted, though all letters will pass through my secretary. Library access approved. Your charitable work may continue under supervision." He offered her the pen. "Anything else, Lady Evangeline?" "Yes. Freedom. Escape. A different life." But she took the pen, felt its weight like a chain, and signed her name in ink that looked black as blood. His hand covered hers before she could withdraw. His skin was cold, not merely cool, but winter cold, grave cold. The cold of something that had forgotten warmth. She gasped, tried to pull away, but his grip held firm. "Welcome to Blackthorne, Lady Evangeline." He leaned close, and she smelled night jasmine and something darker. Something that made her heart race with terror, and something else she refused to name. "I do hope you don't come to regret this." He released her. She stumbled back, cradling her hand as if burned by ice. "Clara will show you to your chambers. We marry in 3 days. I suggest you rest." He turned back to the fire, dismissing her with the finality of a door closing. "You'll need your strength for what's ahead." A girl appeared, young, pale, with eyes that reflected lamplight strangely. Half vampire. Evangeline realized with a jolt. The girl curtsied and gestured toward a side door. The Queen's chambers were beautiful as a gilded cage, silk wallpaper in deep crimson, a 4-poster bed with velvet curtains, windows that overlooked gardens where night-blooming flowers glowed phosphorescent in the darkness, and a door, heavy oak, ornately carved, connecting to what must be the king's chambers. Locked. Evangeline pressed her palm against the wood, felt the barrier between her and the monster she'd just agreed to marry. Then she moved to the window, pressed her forehead against cold glass, and looked out at a world that suddenly felt very far away. Behind her, the locked door was a promise and a threat. Ahead 3 days until she became a vampire's queen, and beneath her corset, hidden in a pocket she'd sewn herself, a letter from Thomas waited. The resistance needed eyes inside Blackthorne Palace. They needed someone close to the vampire king. Evangeline Hartwick had just become that someone. She smiled at her reflection in the dark glass, a sharp, dangerous smile that her father had never seen. If Aleksandr thought he'd purchased a docile bride, he was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. Chapter 2. Queen of Shadows. The wedding dress arrived at dawn. Evangeline woke to find it hanging like a ghost in her chamber, black silk and blood-red lace, cut in the vampire fashion with an elegant neckline that swept low across her collarbones. A collar of rubies adorned her throat where the fabric ended. She touched one stone and found it warm, as if it had drunk heat from living skin. His Majesty selected it himself. Clara stood in the doorway, her half-vampire eyes catching the lamplight. Black for the crown, red for the blood oath. How romantic. Evangeline's fingers traced the rubies. Each one probably cost more than her family's entire estate. "Tell me, Clara, how many human queens has Blackthorne seen?" The girl's face shuddered. "You're the 8th, my lady." And the others? Gone. The word hung in the air like smoke. Gone. Not dead, not escaped, just gone. As if they'd been erased from history. Evangeline felt cold settle in her bones that had nothing to do with the morning chill. The ceremony took place in the palace cathedral as night fell. Evangeline walked down an aisle of black marble while hundreds of vampires watched from pews carved from dark wood. Their eyes reflected the candlelight gold, silver, red like animals watching from a forest's edge. Aleksandr waited at the altar in black and silver, his face a beautiful mask. No warmth touched his expression as she approached. No recognition that this was anything more than a transaction being finalized. The archbishop's voice echoed through the vaulted space, speaking words in Latin that Evangeline only half understood. Something about blood and covenant, darkness and eternity. Shadows pooled in the cathedral's heights where the candlelight couldn't reach. Evangeline could feel the weight of centuries pressing down every vampire queen who had stood here before her. Every human girl who had signed her life away. The air smelled of incense and old stone and something metallic she tried not to identify. When Aleksandr's cold fingers closed around hers, she wondered if the previous 7 queens had felt this same ice spreading through their veins. He slid a ring onto her finger, a band of white gold set with a black diamond that seemed to swallow light. "You may kiss your bride, your majesty." Aleksandr's pale eyes met hers for a heartbeat. Then he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead, a gesture so coldly formal it might as well have been a brand of ownership. The vampires applauded with gloved hands, the sound muffled and strange. The wedding feast was worse. Long tables groaned with food. Evangeline couldn't identify delicacies from regions she'd never heard of, prepared in ways that made her stomach turn. The vampires didn't eat. They held crystal goblets filled with deep crimson liquid that caught the candlelight like rubies. "From willing donors," Clara whispered when she saw Evangeline's expression. "It's legal, part of the treaty." Legal. As if that made it less horrifying. Evangeline sat beside Aleksandr at the high table, aware of every eye in the room dissecting her. The vampire nobles wore their centuries like fine clothing, ancient beings in modern dress, watching the new human queen with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. One woman in particular made her skin crawl. She stood near the fireplace, tall and elegant in emerald silk, with hair like spilled ink and eyes that burned with cold fury. When those eyes locked on Evangeline, she felt the weight of pure hatred. "Lady Cassandra Thornwood." Aleksandr's voice was barely audible. "My former companion. I suggest you avoid her." Before Evangeline could respond, the woman glided forward. She moved like water, like smoke, impossibly graceful. She stopped before their table and sank into a curtsy so perfect it was an insult. "Your Majesties." Her voice was honey over glass. "What a charming bride you've acquired, Aleksandr. So delicate. So very breakable." Evangeline felt every vampire in the room lean forward, scenting blood in the water. "Lady Thornwood." She kept her voice steady. "How kind of you to notice. Though I find that what appears delicate often proves surprisingly resilient. Like spider silk, beautiful, fragile in appearance, yet stronger than steel when tested." Cassandra's smile sharpened. "How poetic. Do you write verse as well, little queen? Perhaps you can compose us an ode to mortality. Something about the fleeting nature of human life. I prefer prose to poetry. Fiction has always seemed more honest than pretty lies dressed in rhyme." A ripple of surprised laughter ran through the nearest vampires. Cassandra's eyes flashed dangerous red. "Careful, child. This court has teeth." "Then it's fortunate I learn quickly." Evangeline lifted her wine glass in mock salute. "I do hope we'll be friends, Lady Thornwood. After all, we have so much in common. We both have such excellent taste in companions." The insult landed like a slap. Cassandra's face went rigid with fury. For a heartbeat, Evangeline thought she'd gone too far, that those elegant hands would transform to claws and rip out her throat. Then Aleksandr spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like ice through flesh. "That will be all, Cassandra." The vampire woman held Evangeline's gaze one moment longer, then turned and melted back into the crowd. But the promise in her eyes was clear: this wasn't over. "You're either very brave or very stupid." Aleksandr's tone held something that might have been amusement. "I haven't decided which. Does it matter?" "It will. When she comes for you." The words should have terrified her. Instead, Evangeline felt a strange exhilaration. She'd faced down a vampire older than her great-grandmother and lived. She'd made them laugh. She'd shown them she had claws of her own. even if they weren't literal. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions, Lord this and Lady that, all of them ancient, all of them watching her like a curious specimen in a jar. She smiled until her face ached, spoke pleasantries until the words turned to ash in her mouth, and felt Aleksandr's cold presence beside her like a wall of ice. When the feast finally ended, Clara led her back to her chambers. Evangeline's feet ached, her head pounded, and exhaustion pulled at her like hands dragging her underwater. "Will he?" She gestured at the locked door connecting to Aleksandr's rooms. "No, my lady. His Majesty has never." Clara's cheeks flushed. "The marriage is political. Nothing more." Relief and something uncomfortably like disappointment warred in Evangeline's chest. She dismissed Clara and stood alone in her gilded cage, still wearing the black and red wedding dress that marked her as property. She should sleep. She should rest. Instead, she found herself drawn to the shelves lining one wall. Books, hundreds of them, leather-bound and ancient. She pulled one down at random and found it was a history of vampire-human relations, written in 1642. Another was poetry in a language she didn't recognize. A third was a botanical text on night-blooming plants. Aleksandr had given her the library she'd requested without her even asking. Hours passed. Evangeline devoured text after text, learning the shape of the world she'd entered. The vampire clans, the blood laws, the delicate balance of the treaty that kept both species from each other's throats. And threaded through it all, hints of something darker, factions within factions, power struggles buried beneath centuries of tradition, and a growing movement of vampire supremacists who viewed humans as nothing more than food. Dawnlight was creeping through the windows when she finally collapsed into bed, still wearing her wedding dress, mind spinning with information. She dreamed of pale eyes watching her from shadows, of cold hands that touched her throat, of a voice whispering in the dark, "Welcome to Blackthorne." When she woke, afternoon sun slanted through the windows. A tray of food sat on the bedside table, still warm, and beside it, a single note in precise handwriting. "The library to open to you. 3rd floor, west wing. Try not to get lost. The palace has a habit of keeping what it catches." No signature, but she recognized the hand from the marriage contract. Evangeline smiled and reached for the paper Thomas had smuggled to her in the folds of her wedding bouquet. Coded instructions from the resistance, asking for information on vampire troop movements, political alignments, weaknesses in palace security. She was a queen now. She had access. She had time. And Aleksandr had no idea he'd just given a spy the keys to his kingdom. In the connecting chamber, on the other side of the locked door, Aleksandr stood in the darkness, holding an identical piece of paper covered in the same resistance code. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Chapter 3. Blood and Roses. 3 months transformed Evangeline from curiosity to threat. She moved through Blackthorne's corridors with growing confidence, learning which vampires could be swayed by charm and which required steel. The half-blood servants whispered information when she treated them with kindness, a revolutionary concept in a palace where most royals barely acknowledged their existence. The younger nobles, those turned in the last century, listened when she spoke of reform during carefully orchestrated garden parties. And slowly, carefully, she fed intelligence to Thomas, guard rotations, supply routes, the names of moderate vampires who might be persuaded toward genuine coexistence rather than grudging tolerance. She was playing a dangerous game, and she knew it. What she didn't know was whether Aleksandr knew it too. The thought haunted her in quiet moments. His note about the library had been kind, almost considerate, but she'd caught him watching her sometimes with those pale eyes, assessing, calculating, impossible to read. He'd given her freedom to move through the palace, to befriend his nobles, to ask her endless questions about vampire politics. Too much freedom, perhaps, as if he wanted to see what she would do with it. She pushed the paranoia aside. She had work to do. "My lady, you're needed in the rose garden." Clara appeared in the library doorway, her expression tight with worry. "Lady Pemberton is hosting a gathering. She specifically requested your presence." Evangeline closed the book on vampire lineages she'd been studying and smoothed her afternoon dress, pale gray silk, that Clara had insisted was appropriate for garden parties. "Is this a request or a summons? With Lady Pemberton, there's no difference." The rose garden was a masterpiece of controlled nature, climbing vines trained along iron trellises, blooms in shades of crimson and black that released their scent only after sunset. 24 vampire ladies occupied wrought iron chairs arranged in careful hierarchy, teacups balanced on laps, eyes sharp as cut glass. Lady Cassandra Thornwood sat at the center like a spider in her web. Ah, our little queen finally graces us with her presence. Cassandra's smile was all fangs. We were just discussing the upcoming parliament session. Such tedious politics. I'm sure you find it all terribly confusing. On the contrary, I find it fascinating. Evangeline accepted a chair a servant pulled forward. Particularly the debate over blood tax reform. Lord Ashford's proposal to reduce the required donations by half seems quite reasonable. Silence fell like a blade. The vampire ladies exchanged glances weighted with meaning Evangeline couldn't quite decipher. Reasonable. Cassandra's voice dripped poison. How charmingly naive. Tell me, Your Majesty, what do you know of vampire needs? Of the hunger that drives us? Of the careful balance between our nature and your precious human sensibilities? I know that blood banks could supplement voluntary donations, that the current system breeds resentment and gives extremists on both sides ammunition for violence, and I know that Lord Ashford's proposal has the King's support. She'd learned that last part from a document carelessly left on Alexander's desk 3 nights ago when she'd picked the lock to his study. The resistance would find that information useful, unless it had been left there deliberately, unless he'd wanted her to find it. She shoved the thought down. Paranoia would destroy her faster than any poison. The King's support. Cassandra rose in one fluid motion, and suddenly all pretense of civility evaporated. She crossed to Evangeline's chair with predatory grace, leaning down until her face was inches away. Let me educate you about your husband, little queen. Aleksandr plays a long game. He's patient. He's calculating. And he views humans as pieces on a board, not partners in governance. Whatever support he shows is strategy, not sympathy. Then it's fortunate I'm not seeking his sympathy. Evangeline held her ground, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Only his cooperation in building something better than this Cold War we're all trapped in. Building something better. Cassandra laughed. The sound like breaking glass. You've been here 3 months, and think you understand centuries of history. You're a child playing at politics, and sooner or later, the explosion of movement came without warning. Lord Ashford materialized from the shadows beyond the roses, his face twisted with rage. Evangeline saw the glint of steel in his hand, a blade, curved and ancient, its edge stained with something dark that made her skin crawl. For humanity. His voice cracked with fanatic intensity. Death to the human filth, corrupting our king. Training she didn't know she possessed took over. Evangeline threw herself sideways as the blade slashed down, catching only fabric. She hit the ground hard, tasted copper where she'd bitten her tongue, heard screaming that seemed to come from very far away. Then Aleksandr was there. She'd never seen him move at full vampire speed. One moment he stood at the garden entrance. The next his hand was around Ashford's throat, lifting the struggling vampire off the ground, like he weighed nothing. Explain. One word, spoken in a voice colder than any Evangeline had heard. Before I scatter your ashes across my roses. She's corrupting you. Ashford choked out, filling your head with human sentiment. The prophecy speaks of a queen who will. His words ended in a gurgle as Aleksandr's grip tightened. The other vampires stood frozen, not one moving to intervene. Cassandra watched with an expression Evangeline couldn't read, triumph mixed with something that might have been fear. Clara. Aleksandr didn't look away from his captive. Take the queen to my chambers. Now. Hands pulled Evangeline to her feet. She felt wetness on her arm and looked down to see blood seeping through torn silk. The blade had caught her after all. The world tilted sideways. I can walk, she managed, but her legs had other ideas. Aleksandr moved faster than thought. Suddenly he was beside her, Ashford crumpling forgotten to the ground. Cold hands caught her before she could fall, lifted her with shocking gentleness. You're injured. His voice had changed, still cold, but threaded with something she'd never heard before. Concern? Impossible. It's nothing, just you're bleeding. He carried her through the palace at inhuman speed, corridors blurring past. That blade was treated with poison. I can smell it. Terror crashed through her like ice water. Poisoned? Shadowbane venom. Designed to cause severe effects in humans. You have perhaps an hour before the symptoms worsen. His jaw clenched. I need to get you to my physician. Hold on, Evangeline. Just hold on. She'd never heard him speak her name before. It sounded strange in his mouth, intimate, almost tender. His chambers were nothing like she'd imagined. No torture devices or coffins. Just dark wood and leather, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a massive bed that looked surprisingly normal. He laid her on it with the care of someone handling spun glass. "Victor!" His shout could have shattered windows. "Get Mordecai. Now." An elderly vampire appeared, moving with the careful deliberation of extreme age. He bent over Evangeline's arm, his face grave. "Shadowbane poison. Concentrated. Whoever prepared this wanted her to suffer greatly." He looked at Aleksandr. "I can counteract it, but it will take time. She'll need to remain still. The effects will be intense. Do it." The next hours existed in a haze of agony that Evangeline experienced as if from a great distance. Heat radiated from the wound, spreading through her arm in waves that made her gasp. Her body trembled despite the blanket someone piled over her. She felt cold and burning simultaneously, her skin hypersensitive to every touch. Through it all, cold hands gripped hers, a cold cloth pressed against her burning forehead, and a voice, Aleksandr's voice, spoke to her from what seemed like a great distance. "Stay with me, Evangeline. You're stronger than this. I've seen your strength, the way you faced Cassandra, the way you moved through my court like you owned it. Don't let some poisoned blade be your ending. Stay with me." She wanted to tell him she wasn't strong, that she was terrified, that she'd been playing a role and now the role had turned real and sharp and deadly. But her throat wouldn't work. She could only grip those cold hands and try not to drown in the fever. When she finally surfaced, gray dawn light filled the windows. The pain had faded to a dull ache. Her mouth tasted like copper and ash. And Aleksandr sat beside the bed, his perfect appearance destroyed. His coat was discarded, his shirt rumpled, his dark hair falling across his forehead. He looked impossibly exhausted. "You stayed." Her voice came out as a croak. His pale eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw past the ice to something raw and unguarded beneath. "You're my queen. Where else would I be? I'm a political convenience. You said so yourself in the contract. Perhaps I was wrong." He stood abruptly, putting distance between them. "Ashford will be executed for treason. The entire incident will be investigated. Clara has your things moved here. You'll sleep in my chambers until security is assured." "In your chambers?" "The adjoining sitting room has a perfectly adequate sofa. I don't sleep much regardless." He moved toward the door, his mask sliding back into place. "Rest, Evangeline. We'll discuss the implications of this attack when you're recovered." "Aleksandr." She struggled to sit up, ignoring the protest from her injured arm. "Thank you for saving me." He paused in the doorway, his back to her. "I've had 6 human brides before you. All of them died within a year. I told myself it was the nature of things, that humans were fragile, that loss was inevitable." He turned, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. "But watching you fight that poison, seeing you so close to dying, I realized I've grown accustomed to your presence, to your stubborn questions in the library, to the way you make my nobles uncomfortable with your ideas, to you." He left before she could respond, the door closing with soft finality. Evangeline lay back against the pillows, his pillows, which smelled of night, jasmine and old books, and pressed her hand to her racing heart. She should feel triumph. She was in his private chambers now, with access to everything the resistance needed. She should be planning her next move, thinking strategically about how to exploit this new proximity. Instead, all she could think about was the exhaustion in his eyes, the careful way he'd held her hand through hours of fever, the raw honesty in his voice when he'd said he'd grown accustomed to her. Was any of it real, or was he playing the same game she was, getting close, earning trust, preparing for an inevitable betrayal? She thought of the resistance code she'd seen in her wedding bouquet, the instructions she'd been following for 3 months, and she thought of an identical piece of paper that might exist somewhere in these very chambers, covered in the same symbols. If Aleksandr knew what she was, why would he save her? Why would he keep her close instead of having her executed? Unless he needed her for something. Unless she was a piece on his board too, being moved toward some purpose she couldn't yet see. Or unless, and this thought terrified her, more than poison or blades, unless the vampire king, who was supposed to be a monster, was starting to care for the spy he'd married. Evangeline closed her eyes and tried not to think about how much easier this mission would be if she could stop caring back. Chapter 4. Crown of Thorns. Evangeline woke to find Aleksandr standing at the window, silhouetted against the gray morning light like a statue carved from shadow. "You should be resting." He didn't turn, his voice carrying that familiar cold precision. But she'd learned to hear what lived beneath the ice now, the subtle variations in tone that betrayed concern he wouldn't name. I've been resting for 2 days. She pushed herself up, ignoring the pull of healing skin. Clara says the palace is in chaos. Ashford's execution. Emergency parliament sessions. Rumors spreading through the courts like wildfire. The rumors are the least of our concerns. Aleksandr finally turned, and the expression on his face sent warning bells clanging through her mind. Get dressed. We need to talk, and what I'm about to tell you requires you to be fully present. 20 minutes later, dressed in a simple day gown with her injured arm carefully bandaged, Evangeline followed him through a hidden door behind his bookshelf. A narrow staircase spiraled down into darkness, lit only by blue-flamed lamps. The air grew colder with each step. They emerged in a chamber that shouldn't exist, a vault carved from solid stone, its walls covered in maps, documents, and what looked like military intelligence. A massive table dominated the center, covered in papers marked with symbols she recognized from the Resistance's coded messages. Her blood turned to ice. Before you panic, Aleksandr said quietly, understand that I've known about your communications with your brother since the 2nd week of our marriage. Evangeline's throat closed. This was it. Execution. Imprisonment. Everything she'd feared. I let it continue because your brother's resistance group, while idealistic and poorly organized, wasn't an actual threat. Unlike the real danger currently positioning itself to destroy everything I've spent 2 centuries building. He moved to the table, gesturing at the documents with barely controlled fury. Come here. Look. Tell me what you see. Numbly. She approached. The papers were intelligence reports, troop movements, financial records, correspondence between vampire lords. Her eyes caught on familiar names. Lord Draven, Lady Cassandra, Lord Pemberton. Even Lord Ashford's name appeared repeatedly, always in connection with a phrase that made her skin crawl. The Restoration. What is this? A coup. Aleksandr's voice was granite. My own cousin, Draven, leads a faction of vampire supremacists who believe my policies are too lenient. They want to return to the old ways, humans as cattle. No treaty, no laws protecting mortal lives. Just predation and power. He pulled forward another document, this one covered in her brother's handwriting. These papers, your resistance obtained. The ones about my supposed plans for a massive crackdown? Forgeries. Planted to provoke your people into doing something spectacularly stupid that would give Draven the excuse he needs. Evangeline's mind raced. The attack on me was supposed to succeed. Ashford was Draven's creature. Your death would have served 2 purposes: eliminate a human queen who was becoming inconveniently influential, and demonstrate to the supremacists that I'm too weak to protect even my own wife. The perfect pretext for a challenge to my rule. She sank into a chair, the implications crashing over her like waves. How long have you known about the coup? Decades. Draven's been patient, building his network. About you specifically being a target? His jaw tightened. Not soon enough. I should have seen it. Should have protected you better. Why are you telling me this? She looked up at him, searching that beautiful, terrible face. Why not just lock me away somewhere safe and handle it yourself? Aleksandr was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something she'd never seen. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, abandoning the royal distance he always maintained. Because I'm tired, Evangeline. The words seemed pulled from somewhere deep. 200 years of ruling alone. 200 years of trusting no one because anyone could be compromised, bought, or turned. I have advisors who might be traitors, a court riddled with spies, and enemies who know exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage. He leaned forward, and the lamplight caught his pale eyes, making them almost human. You have something I don't. Access to the resistance, to humans who watch and report on things my vampire spies never see. Thomas's network is idealistic and unrefined, but they're loyal to each other in ways vampire alliances never are. And you, his voice dropped, you're the only person in 2 centuries who's made me want to trust someone. The vulnerability in those words stole her breath. This was the vampire king who'd faced down rebellions, who ruled with iron will, who'd frightened her so thoroughly on their first meeting. And here he sat, admitting he was tired, admitting he needed help, admitting he wanted to trust her. What are you proposing? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. An alliance. A real one. You help me navigate the human resistance. Identify which groups Draven has infiltrated and which remain genuine. I give you information to pass along, real intelligence about supremacist movements. warnings about planned attacks, proof that I'm not the enemy Thomas thinks I am. Together, we expose Draven's conspiracy before he can trigger the war both sides are stumbling toward. And if I refuse, then you remain confined to these chambers where I can at least keep you breathing, and I continue fighting this battle alone until I either win or Draven puts a stake through my heart. Either way, more people, human and vampire, die unnecessarily. Evangeline studied him, this creature of contradictions who held her fate in cold hands. She thought of the vampire who'd negotiated library access into their marriage contract, who'd sat with her through fevered dreams and poison, who'd just admitted to loneliness that spanned centuries. I want full disclosure. No more secrets about what you're planning or why. Agreed. And Thomas and his core group get immunity. Whatever they've done, whatever intelligence they've gathered, no prosecution. Aleksandr's mouth tightened. That's a dangerous precedent. That's my price. They stared at each other across the table, wills clashing in the silence. Then, impossibly, Aleksandr smiled, a real smile that transformed his face from beautiful to devastating. You're the most infuriating negotiator I've ever encountered. Very well. Immunity for Thomas's immediate circle, but if they do something catastrophically stupid after this agreement, all bets are void. Deal. He extended his hand. She took it, his cold fingers wrapping around hers, and felt the weight of what they'd just agreed to settle over them both. The alliance forged. They spent the next hours planning. Aleksandr showed her the full scope of Draven's network, the vampire lords bought with promises of power, the compromised humans feeding disinformation to resistance groups, the carefully orchestrated attacks designed to escalate tensions. It was intricate, decades in the making, and terrifyingly close to succeeding. There's a gala in 3 days, Aleksandr said as evening shadows crept across the vault. Anniversary of the vampire-human treaty. Every major player will be present. Draven will be watching to see if you've been cowed by the assassination attempt or if you'll continue being a thorn in his side. What do you want me to do? Be yourself. The woman who faced down Cassandra with wit and courage. Show them you're not afraid. His eyes held hers. And dance with me. Let them see a king and queen who are united. Not just bound by contract. It will infuriate Draven and his faction, which makes it strategically valuable. Is that the only reason? The question escaped before she could stop it. Aleksandr went very still. No, he said finally. It's not. The air between them shifted, charged with something neither seemed willing to name. Evangeline's heart beat loud in the silence. I should go, she managed. Thomas will be expecting a message. I need to encode warnings about Draven's infiltration. Evangeline. Aleksandr caught her wrist as she stood, his touch gentle despite the strength that could crush stone. What I said earlier, about growing accustomed to you, that was inadequate. The truth is somewhere between your insufferable stubbornness and surprising brilliance. You've become essential to me. Not as a political asset. As something else. She should pull away. Should maintain professional distance. Should remember this was a vampire who'd lived centuries before her grandparents were born. Instead, she turned her hand in his grip until their fingers laced together. Something else, she repeated softly. That's terrifyingly vague. I'm 200 years old and I don't have words for what this is. Frustration edged his voice. I've had lovers, companions, political partners, but none of them made me feel like my chest was being crushed when I watched them nearly die. None of them made me want to tell them truths I've kept buried for decades. None of them. She kissed him. It was impulse, instinct, the culmination of 3 months of locked doors and longing looks and conversations that felt like foreplay. His lips were cold against hers, but the response was anything but. He made a sound low in his throat and pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her hair while the other pressed against the small of her back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Aleksandr rested his forehead against hers. That complicates things. Everything about us is complicated. True. He smiled against her mouth. 3 days. The gala. We show them a united front. And then? Then we burn Draven's conspiracy to ash. Together. She left him there in the vault, her lips still tingling, her heart racing with fear and exhilaration in equal measure. In her chambers, she found Thomas's latest coded message. Big move planned. Trust no one. Get out if you can. Evangeline sat at her desk and began to write. Her hand steady despite everything. She had warnings to send. Alliances to forge. A coup to prevent. And somewhere in the midst of all that, She'd fallen halfway in love with a vampire king. 3 days until the gala. 3 days until everything would change. She sealed the letter and gave it to Clara, then stood at the window watching night claim the city. Behind her, the door to Aleksandr's chambers stood unlocked for the first time. Chapter 5, Blood Crown. The gala dress was a declaration of war. Evangeline stood before the mirror while Clara fastened the last buttons, hardly recognizing herself. Black silk hugged her body like armor, the neckline cut daringly low but offset by blood-red roses embroidered across the bodice. Her hair was swept up, exposing her throat, a deliberate choice. Aleksandr had said, "Show them you're not afraid. You look like a queen," Clara whispered, her eyes bright with something that might have been pride. A real one. Through the connecting door, she heard Aleksandr moving in his chambers. 3 days of careful planning, of coded messages sent and intelligence gathered. Thomas had confirmed what they'd suspected. Draven's people had infiltrated the resistance leadership, pushing them toward a catastrophic strike during the gala. But Thomas also had loyalists, humans who believed in genuine peace, rather than revenge. Tonight would reveal who stood where when the masks finally fell. Aleksandr emerged dressed in black velvet and silver, every inch the vampire king. But when his eyes found her, something softened in that pale gaze. "Ready?" His voice was steady, but his hand trembled slightly when he offered it. "As I'll ever be." They descended the grand staircase together while the assembled court watched from below. Hundreds of vampires in their finest, glittering with jewels and centuries of accumulated wealth. Evangeline felt their eyes like physical touches, assessing, judging, hungry. At the bottom, Lord Draven waited. He was handsome in the way all old vampires were. Time had refined his features to classical perfection. Dark hair, strong jaw, eyes that burned with cold intelligence. When he bowed, it was precisely correct and utterly mocking. "Cousin, how delightful to see you've recovered from that unfortunate incident." His smile was all teeth. "And our brave little queen, looking remarkably resilient." "One might think the attack never happened at all. One might think many things," Evangeline replied smoothly. "The truth, however, tends to reveal itself in time. Often when least convenient for those hiding it." Draven's eyes flashed. "How very philosophical. Do you enjoy philosophy, Your Majesty? Or do you prefer more practical pursuits?" "I find that philosophy and practicality aren't mutually exclusive, Lord Draven. For instance, the philosophical question of justice tends to have very practical applications. Wouldn't you agree?" Before he could respond, Aleksandr's hand tightened on her waist. "If you'll excuse us, cousin. The Queen and I have other guests to greet." They moved through the ballroom like pieces on a chessboard, each conversation laden with double meanings. Lady Cassandra appeared, stunning in emerald that made her look like a poisonous flower. She circled them with predatory grace. "What a pretty picture you make," she purred. "King and Queen, united before the court. Almost convincing. Tell me, does he visit your bed yet? Or are you still sleeping in separate rooms? Jealousy doesn't suit you, Cassandra." Aleksandr's voice could have frozen blood. "And my private life is not court gossip." "Everything is court gossip when you're king." She leaned close to Evangeline, her breath cold against her ear. "Enjoy your moment, little human. Draven's people are everywhere. Before this night ends, you'll understand exactly how fragile your position is." She glided away, leaving Evangeline's heart pounding. "That was a threat," she whispered. "I know." Aleksandr pulled her toward the center of the ballroom, where space had been cleared for dancing. "Which means we're running out of time. The attack will come soon. Stay close to me." The orchestra began playing a waltz, haunting and beautiful. Aleksandr's hand found the small of her back, his other hand clasping hers with a gentleness that belied his strength. They began to move. Evangeline had learned to dance as a girl, of course. But this was different. Aleksandr led with the unconscious grace of someone who'd perfected the skill across centuries. They flowed across the floor while the court watched, and she felt the symbolism of every step, human and vampire, moving in perfect synchronization. "I'm terrified," she admitted quietly, her voice hidden beneath the music. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp." His pale eyes held hers. "But know this, I will not let them hurt you. Whatever happens tonight, whatever Draven has planned, you're under my protection. I've failed 6 queens before you. I will not fail a 7th. I'm not just a queen to protect. I'm your partner. Your ally. You're more than that." His voice dropped lower, intimate despite the hundreds watching. You've become the reason I want to survive this night. The reason I care whether my kingdom burns or flourishes. You've made me feel things I'd forgotten were possible. And now I can't imagine going back to the cold numbness I existed in before. Her breath caught. Aleksandr. The lights exploded. Glass shattered from the chandeliers as something explosives. She realized with horror detonated above. Screams erupted. Vampires moved with supernatural speed, some fleeing, others drawing weapons that had been concealed beneath formal wear. Aleksandr pulled her close, shielding her body with his. It started. Stay with me. Through the chaos, she saw them, men in black, human resistance fighters pouring through shattered windows, but also vampires, Draven's people, attacking both Aleksandr's loyalists and the humans in a calculated frenzy designed to look like resistance aggression. They're framing Thomas's people. Evangeline gasped. This is exactly what Draven wanted, proof that humans can't be trusted. Justification for ending the treaty. A vampire lunged at them, fangs bared. Aleksandr moved faster than thought, catching the attacker by the throat and hurling him across the room with bone-crushing force. Get to the library. There's a safe room behind the philosophy section. No. She grabbed his arm. Thomas is here. I saw him in the crowd. If Draven's people capture him, they'll execute him as the mastermind, and your moderate allies won't be able to object. I have to find him. Evangeline, you'll be killed. Then come with me. She pulled at him with desperate strength. You said we're partners. Prove it. Trust me to do this. For a heartbeat, she saw the war in his eyes, centuries of ruling alone versus 4 months of learning to share the burden. Then he nodded sharply. Stay behind me. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understood. They plunged into the chaos together. Aleksandr fought with terrifying efficiency, each movement precise and lethal. Evangeline stayed close, her mind racing. Where would Thomas be? He was smart enough to realize this was a trap, which meant the servants' corridor. She pointed toward a side door. He'd avoid the main battle. Try to reach me through the back passages. They ran. Behind them, the sounds of fighting grew more desperate. They burst through the door into narrow hallways lit by guttering lamps, and found Thomas backed against a wall by 3 of Draven's vampires, a blade in his hand and terror in his eyes. Get away from him. Evangeline's voice rang with authority she didn't know she possessed. The vampires turned, sneering. The little queen. Lord Draven will reward us well for your head. You'll have to go through me first, Aleksandr said quietly, and the temperature in the corridor seemed to drop 10 degrees. What followed was brutal and swift. Aleksandr moved through the attackers with controlled fury, each motion economical and devastating. Within moments, all 3 lay unconscious, and Thomas stood trembling but unharmed. Evie, her brother's voice cracked. What have you become? Someone who can save you. Come on, we need to get to the vault. We have the evidence to end this. They ran through the palace, Aleksandr leading them through passages Evangeline had never seen. Behind them, the sounds of battle echoed, shouts, crashes, the inhuman shrieks of vampires in combat. But ahead Draven waited. He stood in the great hall, blocking their path to the royal chambers. Behind him, Cassandra and 24 of his most loyal vampires formed a wall of predatory menace. The evidence vault lay beyond, so close, yet impossibly far. Going somewhere, cousin. Draven's smile was a razor. I've been so looking forward to this moment. 2 centuries of watching you play the benevolent ruler, pretending humans are anything more than cattle. And now you've bound yourself to one, given her a crown, made yourself weak for her sake. Caring for someone doesn't make you weak, Aleksandr replied, his voice cold as death. It makes you dangerous. Because now I have something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. How touching. Draven drew a blade, ancient, silver, etched with runes that made Evangeline's skin crawl. Let's test that theory. Kill the human, take the queen, and we'll see how dangerous grief makes you. His forces surged forward. What happened next would be written about in vampire histories for centuries to come. Aleksandr, the cold king who'd ruled with calculated precision for 200 years, unleashed the full fury of his power. He moved like winter's wrath given form, protecting Evangeline and Thomas with a ferocity that transcended strategy. But even he couldn't fight them all. Evangeline saw it before anyone else, the way Draven's forces were positioning themselves, cutting off every escape route. They weren't just trying to kill Aleksandr, they were hurting him, separating him from her and Thomas, creating the perfect opening for Cassandra lunged from the side, impossibly fast, her claws reaching for Evangeline's throat. Time seemed to slow. Evangeline saw her own death in those burning eyes, saw Thomas's horror, saw Alexander's desperate lunge. Too far away, too late. The doors behind Draven exploded inward. Vampire nobles poured through Lords Ashwood and Pemberton, Lady Victoria and a dozen others, all of them moderates who'd been quietly gathering their forces while Draven had focused on the gala. And with them, armed resistance fighters, Thomas's loyalists, the ones who'd chosen peace over vengeance. "The Human Queen sent us proof," Lord Ashwood announced, his voice carrying through the sudden chaos. "Documents, evidence, every crime, every conspiracy, every murder you've committed in the name of restoration. Draven. Parliament has seen it all. And they've voted." He drew his sword, and the moderates behind him did the same. "You are stripped of title, lands, and the protection of vampire law. Surrender now, or face the consequences." Draven's face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You'd side with humans against your own kind." "We're siding with the law," Lady Victoria said coldly. "And with a king who's proven he'll protect both our peoples, not sacrifice one for the benefit of the other." For one terrible moment, Evangeline thought Draven would fight anyway, would rather die than surrender. But he was ancient, and the ancient knew when a battle was truly lost. His eyes found Aleksandr across the hall, burning with hatred that would never fade. "This isn't over." "Yes," Aleksandr said quietly, his arm around Evangeline's waist. "It is." Draven lunged not at Aleksandr, but at the nearest window. Glass shattered as he threw himself through, disappearing into the London night. Cassandra and half his forces followed, choosing exile over capture. The rest, surrounded and outnumbered, surrendered. In the silence that followed, Evangeline felt her legs give out. Aleksandr caught her, held her, and for a long moment they simply stood there while the court watched Vampire King and Human Queen, alive against all odds. "You sent the evidence before we even left for the gala," Aleksandr murmured against her hair. "When?" 3 days ago. "I wasn't going to watch you fight alone." She pulled back to meet his eyes. "We're partners, remember? That means I protect you too." Something in his expression cracked, the last wall of ice finally melting. "You're impossible. You're immortal. You'll have centuries to get used to it." "Centuries," he repeated, and she heard the longing in his voice, the unspoken question hanging between them. Later, after Parliament had convened an emergency session, after Thomas's group had been granted full pardons and recognition as an official peacekeeping force, after the moderates had sworn renewed oaths to the crown and to the treaty, after the wounded had been tended and the dead honored and the palace put back together, after all of that, Evangeline and Aleksandr stood alone in his chambers. "Draven will rebuild," she said quietly. "Find new allies. Try again. Yes. And we'll be ready." He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "But there's something we need to discuss first. You're human, Evangeline. You'll age. In 60 years, perhaps 70 if you're fortunate, you'll die. And I'll continue existing, as I have for 2 centuries. She'd known this was coming, had thought about it during countless sleepless nights. "Are you asking me to become like you?" "I'm asking what you want. Because if you choose to remain human, I'll cherish every moment we have. And if you choose transformation..." He paused, something almost like fear crossing his face. "I'll make sure you know exactly what you're accepting. The hunger, the isolation, the weight of centuries. It's not the romantic eternity poets write about. It's difficult and often lonely, and you can never go back." Evangeline thought of her father, her family, the human life she'd left behind. She thought of Thomas and his resistance fighters, of Clara and the half-blood servants, of all the humans who looked to her as a bridge between worlds. "If I became vampire, I'd lose that connection. I'd stop being their queen, the human who married a vampire king and survived. I'd just be another immortal who couldn't understand their fears anymore." "Yes," Aleksandr said honestly. "You would. Then I'd choose mortality." She took his hands, felt the cold that no longer frightened her. "Not forever. Ask me again in 50 years. When I've lived a full human life. When I've done everything I want to do with my limited time. But for now," she smiled, "for now, let me be what they need me to be. The human queen who proves we can coexist. Who shows that love between our peoples is possible." 50 years, he whispered. "So brief, then we'd better not waste them." She kissed him, and he responded with a desperation that spoke of every year he'd lived alone, every queen he'd lost, every moment he'd thought he'd never feel this again. When they finally broke apart, dawn was breaking over London, pale gold light spilling through the windows of Blackthorne Palace, touching the vampire king and his human queen. "What happens now?" Evangeline asked. Aleksandr smiled a real smile, warm despite his cold nature. "Now, we rebuild. We reform Parliament, strengthen the treaty, hunt down Draven's remaining supporters. We deal with the 1,000 small crises that come with ruling." He pulled her close. "And somewhere in all of that, we learn how to be married. Actually married, not just politically bound." That sounds terrifying. More than vampire conspiracies and assassination attempts. Much more. But she was smiling too. "I came to Blackthorne planning to spy on you. You know. To gather intelligence and help overthrow vampire rule. I know. I told you I've known since the second week. And you let me stay anyway. Let me close. Gave me access to everything." She shook her head in wonder. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, his pale eyes reflecting the rising sun. "Because in 200 years, you were the first person who looked at me and saw something worth saving instead of something to be used or feared. And I thought." He touched her face with infinite gentleness. "I thought perhaps that was worth the risk." Was it? Every moment. Even the terrifying ones. Especially those. He kissed her forehead. "You've changed me, Evangeline Hartwick. Made me believe that perhaps I can be more than the cold king history painted. Perhaps I can be someone worthy of the woman who faced down assassins and conspiracies, and her own fears to stand beside me. You already were worthy." She pressed her hand over his silent heart. "You just needed someone to remind you." Outside, London woke to news of the failed coup, of the queen who'd saved the kingdom, of a vampire king who'd chosen love over power. There would be challenges ahead, there always were. Draven would plot in exile. The supremacists would regroup. The delicate balance between human and vampire would require constant vigilance. But for now, in the pale morning light, a king and queen stood together. And for the first time in 200 years, Aleksandr felt something he'd thought lost forever. Hope. Epilogue. 5 years later, the library had become Evangeline's favorite room in Blackthorne, not just for the books, though those remained a treasure, but for the memories it held. She'd kissed Aleksandr here for the first time, planned rebellions and reforms, decoded messages and drafted treaties. Now she sat at her usual desk, reviewing the latest proposal from the Human Vampire Council, her creation, formed 3 years ago to give humans genuine representation in vampire governance. Thomas led the human delegation, and remarkably, he and Aleksandr had developed something approaching friendship. "You're working too late again." Aleksandr appeared in the doorway, still dressed in the formal attire from that evening's parliament session. "The physicians said you need more rest." Evangeline pressed a hand to her slightly rounded belly, feeling the flutter of life within. "The baby's fine. I'm fine. And this proposal is important. The proposal can wait until morning." He crossed to her, pulled her gently from the chair. "You, however, cannot. Come." He led her to their chambers, no longer separated by locked doors, but unified into a suite that reflected both their tastes. Human warmth and vampire elegance, somehow blended into something entirely their own. "I still can't believe it," she murmured as he helped her out of her formal gown. A human carrying a vampire's child. The physicians said it was nearly impossible. "You've made a habit of doing the impossible." His hand covered hers on her belly, cold against warm. "Though I won't lie, I'm terrified. No vampire-human hybrid has been born in over a century. We don't know what to expect. We'll figure it out. Like we've figured out everything else." She turned in his arms. "Together." "Together," he agreed, and kissed her with a tenderness that still, after 5 years, made her heart race. Later, as she drifted toward sleep, Evangeline thought about the girl she'd been desperate, angry, willing to betray a monster for her family's sake. That girl could never have imagined this. Genuine peace between the species, her brother working alongside vampires, her family's debts long forgotten, and her own heart so thoroughly claimed by the very creature she'd been sent to destroy. "Aleksandr?" she whispered into the darkness. Ask me again. About the transformation. About becoming like you." She felt him go still beside her. "Evangeline, not now. Not yet. But someday. When our child is grown. When I've lived a full mortal life." She squeezed his hand. Ask me then. Because I want centuries with you. I want to see what we build together. I want to watch our child grow, and their children, and watch the world change in ways we can't imagine yet. Even knowing what you'll lose, your humanity, your warmth, your connection to mortal life, I'll gain something too. Time. Time to love you. Time to finish what we've started. She turned to face him in the darkness. And maybe by then, we'll have built a world where being vampire or human matters less than being good. Where our child can grow up without choosing sides. Where what we've started actually lasts. He pulled her close, and she felt the tremor in his hands, emotion he still struggled to express, even after 5 years of practice. I'll ask, he promised, when the time comes. And if your answer is yes. His voice dropped to a whisper. I'll make sure you never regret it. I know. And she did. Because beneath the Vampire King, beneath the cold exterior and centuries of isolation, she'd found something precious and rare. She'd found someone worth eternity. As sleep claimed her, Evangeline smiled. Somewhere in the palace, her brother worked with vampire counselors on new reforms. In London's streets, humans and vampires navigated their uneasy peace with growing confidence. And in exile, Draven plotted, but his power had been broken, his support scattered. The work would never be finished. There would always be new challenges, new threats, new battles to fight. But now, she wouldn't face them alone, and neither would he. In the darkness of Blackthorne Palace, a vampire king held his human queen and their unborn child, and dreamed of a future worth the centuries ahead. The end was only the beginning. The end.